Welcome, brothers. Let's discuss single mothers and single motherhood today. Today I'm going to share a number of ideas about single motherhood that I've learned from reading, observation, and personal experience, which have led me to the conclusion that single mothers themselves and single motherhood itself is the most destructive force in the black community. I'm going to divide my thesis into 3 parts as follows. I'm going to explain the truth about how and why women become single mothers. I'm going to explain why the black community has been worst hit by this scourge. And I'm going to explain why you should avoid embarking on serious relationships with single mothers, and why I think you should totally avoid single mothers if you're a very young man under 25. Contrary to what most of us think, the most traditional and natural form of family is indeed the single mother family. For one simple reason, because motherhood is established biologically. The child issues from the mother, so there can be no doubt who the child's mother is. Single motherhood is nothing new. Our distant ancestors, the first men and women to walk the earth, were raised by single mothers, just as we see in most of the animal kingdom. Our ancestral fathers merely supplied the seed. They drifted in and out of female settlements, leaving only babies behind, and played no role whatsoever in child raising. Our ancestral fathers didn't know who their children were, and neither did our ancestral mothers. How could they? In the beginning, they probably didn't even know that the father's seed was the element that created new life in the woman. No, they didn't make that discovery until much later. In fact, I doubt that anyone, without an agenda that is, can tell us even the approximate date when they finally figured it out. So for this part we're going to engage in some speculation. I would theorize that when men finally realized that their reproductive input is what caused pregnancy in women, it is at this point that our ancestral fathers began to feel that they had a role to play in raising their children. And it is at this point that we see the beginnings of patriarchy, the male-headed family. Our ancestral fathers now knew that sex caused pregnancy, and that pregnancy resulted in childbirth. But they still couldn't be sure which man fathered a given child. The only way they could be sure that a child was theirs was to limit the number of men who had sexual access to a woman to 1. Thus we see the emergence of marriage and the 2-parent family. Once a man could be sure that a child was his, and that his wife was faithful and bonded to him for life, our ancestral fathers got on with the work of carving civilization with their bare hands out of a technological oblivion. You see, for men, knowing who your children are and knowing your children's mother is bonded and committed only to you and your family is the single most important factor that led to the creation of all human civilizations. In other words, the way of life we enjoy or endure today. When our ancestral mothers run things, i.e. when human society was matriarchal, we made little progress. No means of recording the way of life were developed under matriarchy. So we have nothing but guesswork and perhaps what we see in today's matriarchal communities to tell us how things probably went down. And if we look at today's most matriarchal communities, i.e. the black community, what do we find? We find poverty, backwardness, underachievement. We find hordes of aimless and unfocused young men. We find arrested development, violence, crime, bullying, intimidation, rampant out-of-wedlockism, sexual disease, and just about every social pathology you can name. Which tells us what? about the first matriarchy. It tells us that life in the original matriarchy was probably brutal, painful, and short. So this is our first polemic against single motherhood. But what has any of this to do with dating single mothers, Thuctician? Simple. Those who date single mothers are dating women who reject the authority of fatherhood and the creative genius of patriarchy, and are thus denying men the thing that most motivates men to serve their communities and create a better world. They are enabling women for whom independence, which is in truth a euphemism for sexual liberation, is more important than maintaining the integrity of our communities. They are enabling women who will ultimately destroy whatever is left of the black community by their refusal to commit to one man with whom they will raise their children until said children are independent adults. In dating single mothers, you are an enabler of women for whom promiscuity is more important than community. Now, many of you have identified that women of other races make much more compliant girlfriends and wives. This is because they are born into cultures where patriarchy, i.e. male authority, has established itself as supreme. Not so in our culture. Black men are unique in that we've been subordinated by white men throughout our entire journey in the non-African world. We never had any authority over women to begin with, except for a short time after emancipation in America, where prosperous black towns were springing up everywhere. Sadly, these towns were destroyed by jealous and fearful whites, as always. But they prove that left on our own without the pernicious threat of white supremacy, we thrived. In that short post-slavery period, black women had two choices: either stay with us and be loved, respected, protected, and free, or return to the slave master who abused them. And that's the environment we have to recreate today. We have to create an environment where they only have two choices: us or welfare. You don't ask, beg, whine, or cry about who women choose. You make it so that you are the only choice. Now let's go back to our ancestral fathers. How did they deal with women who refused to submit to patriarchy? Well, it's very simple. Promiscuous women would have been cast out of the tribe and left to fend for themselves. That's why today we don't like hoes. Our hatred of hoes is a genetic legacy of those old black men, the first ones to say no to a hoe. You must learn from them. The first thing we must do is say no to hoes. More layer.